Oh, I think we're going live now, so we can start. Sorry, Margareta, we cut you off very quickly, but it's because the broadcast started. Okay, so good evening, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. Tonight we will be talking about the recent resolution or draft resolution at the United Nations that is titled L12. So basically, recently 89 countries voted in favor of a draft resolution at the UN Fourth Committee requesting an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on two issues: the long denial of Palestinians' right to self-determination and whether or not the situation of the Israel's occupation in the occupied territories is legal or illegal. So with us here, we have a variety of top experts in the field who will be addressing the issue from two perspectives. One is to explain the dynamics of this resolution and its significance and its main implications. And the other will be colleagues who will address the positions of EU member states on this resolution, where unfortunately the majority of EU member states either abstained or voted against the resolution. Only a minority supported it, including Poland and Ireland. So we will be discussing that as well. The resolution has made quite a significant controversy when it was being discussed. The Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Gilad Erdan, he said that it's a weapon of mass destruction in the jihad war of defaming Israel. And the United States was, quote, torpedoing the resolution and trying to prevent it from coming to pass. So today we will start first with Ms. Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories since 1967. Ms. Albanese brings a very remarkable record of scholarly work on the Palestinian topic, particularly on the issues of the right of return and on the issue of the right to self-determination. She recently authored a report on the Palestinian right to self-determination and the implications of the long denial of this right. So we go to Francesca first. If you could please tell us a bit about what this resolution signifies, what is built on, and why is it important?
Jeg har også været på det. Jeg ved, at de bækkede på den. De droppede vores aftale. Nå. Okay. Vi skal ikke have en proxy.
We cannot hear you. If you can please.
No, I can't hear you. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
no.
I heard my name, but there is a sound in the background. Can you please
Yes,
repeat the
now it's
question?
working.
Sorry.
Yeah, you can go ahead now. Now it's working.
Okay, so this resolution is groundbreaking in many respects. Not because it's the first time that the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, is asked to give an opinion on the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. Not because it's the first time that UN as a whole is asked to pronounce itself on the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, but precisely because for 55 years we have had resolutions of the UN Security Council and many more, of the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, and all of them have remained unfollowed, not enforced. And meanwhile, the occupation, the Israeli occupation that started in 1967 in the, it's called the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, which constitute what the international consensus agrees is, and in line with international law, the territorial unity where the Palestinians should exercise the right of self-determination in the form of independence stated, all of this has remained dead letter. Therefore, 55 years later, the international community is confronted with what to do with the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. Because the crux of the matter, as I've tried to highlight and emphasize in my first report as a special rapporteur, which was, as you mentioned, presented to the General Assembly recently, remains the fact that the right of all rights, the right of self-determination, I'm sorry, the light went off. Oh. Yeah, the beauty of the United Nations energy saving strategies. So the 55 years have served to consolidate, I was saying, the violation of the rights of the Palestinian people, the right of self-determination. Without this right, which is the collective right par excellence, no other right can have a meaning. So we can discuss about the realization of economic, social, and cultural rights, or civil and political rights, but none of these can be fully realized without realizing the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people, which means, first and foremost, the right to be independent, free from alien domination and colonial rule. So this advisory opinion that has been requested to the court, and it's important to frame the context, is an opportunity to tackle the overarching issue, the overarching structure, and the very presence of Israeli occupation, military occupation, but also colonial presence in the territory that should become independent, and for the Palestinians to exercise their sovereignty. So what is required to the court is to pronounce itself over the question of the consequences of the prevention of the realization of the right of self-determination for the Palestinian people. And also, what are the legal consequences, not only for Israel, but also for the international community? Because the ongoing violation by Israel of the right of self-determination has translated into a reality, has morphed into a reality which is made of other violations and possibly international crimes. So what are the consequences of what I often call a legal monstrum? Because it's made of different intersecting forms of illegality. But also the other question that has been asked to the court, that will be asked to the court, is how do the policies and practices that Israel has put in place, violating the right of self-determination and possibly committing other illegal facts, how does it affect the legal status of the occupation, and with which consequences for other states and for the United Nations as a whole? And I think, and with this, I would stop also to give the opportunity to other colleagues to interject, so that we have a dialogue. This is going to be very interesting, because one of the issues that I have raised, and my immediate predecessor, but also his predecessors have raised as special rapporteurs, is that we wouldn't have arrived to the current reality hadn't it been also for the impunity that the international community has granted Israel. The fact that there has been a protracted violations of international law, humanitarian law, human rights law, and international criminal law without concrete action by anyone to enforce the international law via accountability, but also via diplomatic, political, and economic measures. So all these hopefully will be addressed by the court.
Perfect. That was very perfect and very much on time. I would look forward to discussing more of this aspect with you later on, particularly on the issues of the implications of if the ICJ rules that the occupation is illegal, similar to the way it ruled the occupation of Namibia is illegal. What would be the implication of that in terms of Israel's position, in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and in terms of the Palestinian rights and Israel's relations internationally. But I will move to the second guest we have here, which is Victor Catan. He's a senior research fellow at Nottingham University at the Faculty of Social Science, a legal expert on this topic who has written on this particular issue. And we're very interested to hear your perspective on what does the ICJ, what is its significance, what would its ruling signify, what would be the implications of it, and what would be the process, what kind of process would it likely to be? Would we witness a similar level of what Palestinians view as procrastination at the International Criminal Court, for example, where it has been taking several years without any end in sight, or would it be a more timely and duly processed? So handing the mic to Victor.
Thank you, Mohammed. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to speak to all of you this evening. So one point I should make at the outset is that this resolution hasn't yet been adopted by the UN General Assembly. So it's not actually been referred to the International Court of Justice. This was a resolution that was adopted by the United Nations Special Political and Decolonization Committee, and it will be voted again at the plenary session of the General Assembly next month. So under the UN Charter, only UN organs and specialized agencies can request advisory opinions. So we still have to wait to see what will happen at the vote in the General Assembly next month. And it's only when a majority of states vote in favor of that resolution that the question which appears in paragraph 18 of the resolution will be referred to the International Court of Justice. The resolution, however, if it is referred, of course, it will be significant in the sense that it will be the first time a question about the occupation is being asked. In other words, the crux of the issue rather than ancillary issues to deal with, for example, the construction of a wall. It's not the first time Palestinians have tried to engage the International Court of Justice. There have been several previous attempts, historic attempts, going back to 1947 and 1948 during the partition plan by the United Nations and the establishment of Israel, when countries including Egypt, Iraq, and Syria presented draft resolutions to the UN General Assembly, but they didn't get enough votes. Then there was another attempt in the 1980s by Egypt and Jordan to refer a question to the International Court on the legality of settlements. That didn't even make it to the UN because it kind of died in the Arab League. And then the question that was asked of the International Court of Justice in 2003, that's the wall opinion, was actually based on these earlier attempts. And it was focused primarily on the construction of the wall and its associated regime of settlement activity. And the ICJ delivered a virtually unanimous ruling describing the wall and its associated regime, including the settlements, as being contrary to international law. So this resolution is slightly different in that it takes a step back and it looks at the overarching picture of the occupation since 1967. As Francesca mentioned, the protracted violation of the right of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination, including the prolonged occupation, because occupation is supposed to, in theory, be a temporary phenomenon. Settlements, annexation, demographic changes in East Jerusalem, in occupied East Jerusalem, or the holy city of Jerusalem. And interestingly, the question also asks about discriminatory legislation and measures. And that's quite intriguing because if we look at the there isn't a transcript, but if we look for the explanation of voting records in the Special Political Decolonization Committee, I noticed that Niger, Bangladesh, and South Africa all referred to apartheid, which is quite strong language. So that could be potentially quite interesting. As Mohammed mentioned, 98 states voted in favor of the resolution, 17 voted against, and there were 52 abstentions. Those countries in Europe that voted in favor of the resolution included Ireland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Poland, Portugal, and Slovenia. So that's a lot more than voted in favor of the resolution in 2003 when all EU states had abstained. In terms of the time factor, Mohammed, you asked about the time factor. If this resolution is voted on next month, the question is framed as an urgent one, which could mean that the issue would be referred directly to the International Court of Justice, to the registrar. At that point, all members of the United Nations would be invited to present written statements if they want to participate in the process, and they'll be given, I don't know, a timeline, maybe a few months. Palestine would also submit written statement, and then the court would set times for oral statements, oral pleadings to be made. So it could actually be quite rapid. It could be, if the resolution was voted on next month, it could be, the arguments could be taking place before the International Court within 6 months. And then I don't know how long the court will obviously take longer to produce the opinion, but it's different to the process, very different to the process at the International Criminal Court. So we shouldn't confuse the two courts. And the ICJ can in this situation act much more quickly. But we must remember the court is being asked to give advice to the United Nations General Assembly, and there's no legal obligation on those members to follow that advice. Although, of course, in producing its advice, the International Court would be engaging with questions of international law, which may, over time, influence the development of customary international law. And as a principal judicial organ of the United Nations, of course, it's held by quite a few states to be quite authoritative on questions of international law. I can say a lot more, but I'll leave my comments there for the time being, and we can discuss further issues later. Thank you.
Yep, thank you so much. That was a certainly remarkable and insightful presentation. We can turn next to the European positions on this resolution, as well as Israel's overreaction to the resolution itself in a way that was seemingly unprecedented. Like the input that Israel's ambassador to the UN gave at the General Assembly was quite fascinating, to describe this as a weapon of mass destruction in a jihadi war. So I think we first turn to Martin now to discuss a bit on the European positions, why you think we had this sort of outcome, what is the main significance or the main inferences that can be drawn from the abstention of the majority of European member states, particularly in light of the situation of of Russia's occupation of Ukraine. And in addition to, if you can convince and persuade European member states to vote in favor of the resolution as it comes up next December, what would be your main argumentation on why the EU should vote in favor? So I head to Martin next, who is the head of the European Middle East Project. He's based in Belgium, and a very remarkable and talented and thoughtful voice on the Israeli-Palestinian topic, whose writings I'm very acquainted with and usually keen on reading. So turning to Martin now, if you can please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you, Mohammed, and hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here. So I will address indeed the European aspect and European vote. These kinds of vote in the UN, they force the Europeans and all countries around the world to kind of show their true colors. The EU countries, as you have noted already, have been split completely in 3 ways. So you had 7 member states voting in favor, 13 member states abstaining, and 7 member states voting against. And the composition of these blocks is not too surprising for anyone who is following the dynamics of the EU quite closely. There are some surprises, maybe with Poland. I didn't expect them to vote in favor, for example. Germany voting against is very, very disappointing, maybe not too surprising, but still, with a green foreign minister. And France abstaining rather than voting in favor is also quite a disappointment. But these positions broadly reflect the kind of long-standing trends and positions of these member states, and also electoral changes. So, Italy with its new government, a hard-right government, has shifted more into the so-called pro-Israel or Israel-aligned camp. So they voted no. Sweden has a more right-wing government, so they shifted, they abstained. Maybe they would have supported with the previous government. We don't know. We don't know for sure. But as Victor mentioned already, it's interesting to compare this pattern with what happened. It's now almost 20 years ago during the previous vote on the previous opinion of the Court of Justice on the wall, and at that moment, all EU member states were unified in abstaining, and this time we have all of them being split. And I think that's partly because of growing internal polarization on this issue. But it's also because 20 years ago, all the member states, the EU was very strong with its talking point, claiming that the opinion of the Court of Justice, yes, back then, that it would undermine efforts to restart dialogue between the parties. And today, and that was at the time when there was still a prospect for restarting the peace process. It was the time of the US-led roadmap, etc. Today, there is no such prospect for relaunching of the peace process, and yet some countries are still using the same talking point, which is now completely empty, to justify their opposition to this resolution. And in the first place, it is the United States, which has been, saying that this could undermine efforts to bring the two parties together and restart peace talks. Yet it is the United States itself which has been making clear that, under the Biden administration, the policy has been clear: we will not pursue the peace process. And as they say, the time is not ripe to restart a peace talk. So the Americans have given up on that and basically acquiesced to maintaining the situation as it is. And yet, when there is this attempt to do something new and to, let's say, reaffirm the international legality on the conflict, they still, twist the reality and claim that this could harm the peace efforts. And so some Europeans, the Brits, the Austrians, the Czechs have used the same sort of rhetoric. The other, and I will say maybe 2 or 3 more points, because I think this rhetoric is actually very revealing and important to understand and to see through it. Another talking point, again, the Americans led on that, was claiming that this is singling out Israel. And yet there were 16 different advisory opinions of the International Court of Justice previously, and dozens of other judgments by the International Court of Justice. So how is this singling out Israel or any state? Again, this is turning the reality completely upside down. And the third talking point, again, by the Americans and reflected, for example, by the Czech Republic, was claiming that this is a unilateral move. But here we are talking about a multilateral body, United Nations General Assembly, requesting another multilateral body, the International Court of Justice, to give an opinion. So to call this unilateral is really an Orwellian twisting of the language. And so now the EU jointly didn't follow these talking points. As I said, some member states on the opposing side did, but the EU jointly, they didn't say much because they were so divided, but they objected to 2 things. One was that there was too little time to thoroughly discuss this proposal, so very procedural, sort of an excuse. And secondly, that there is a reference to Haram al-Sharif without mentioning the Temple Mount, which actually used to be quite a common practice in UN resolutions in the past. But in more recent years, this has been construed successfully to kind of claim that this is a denial of Jewish ties to the holy sites, and some Western states have jumped on this and have followed this campaign, while it is actually mainly the Israeli government which is undermining the status quo on the holy sites on the ground. So the bottom line is I have really followed very closely, as much as possible, the justifications and the rationales that countries opposing the resolution gave publicly and in some cases privately. And my conclusion is that there is nothing genuine here, that there is no legitimate reason to oppose this. And therefore, I think we can conclude that those states who voted against this are basically happy with maintaining the situation as it is, as permanent occupation with no international accountability and oversight. I'll maybe stop here, and maybe we can talk about some of the more like forward-looking aspects of this in the discussion afterwards.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for a fascinating and comprehensive presentation, very detailed on the positions of member states and these sort of nitty-gritty details of member states abstaining or voting against because of certain terminology, Haram al-Sharif, Temple Mount, etc. I would, of course, be very eager to hear more from you about a forward-looking perspective of why it should be supported and why is it in the interest of EU member states to be on board. Turning now to our fourth speaker, leaving the best for last. So now we have Hugh Lovett, who is a senior fellow at the European Center for Foreign Relations. He has written extensively on both the Israeli-Palestinian topic and the topic of the Western Sahara, and he has advised European member states on Israeli-Palestinian issues, whether it's the foreign ministries or diplomatic personnel on the ground, and he has made several appearances in the media also on the topic. So turning to you, Hugh, if you can please also address this sort of European perspective, as well as Israel's own reaction or overreaction, as it was described, to this resolution, of trying to frame it as some sort of the, or as it was presented by the Israeli ambassador to the UN, as the last nail in the coffin of a peace process, and threatening some sort of harsh retaliation if this step is taken. So if you can please go ahead with both issues.
Sure. And thank you so much for putting this together. I tend to think that one can judge the merit or the value of any initiative based on the ferocity of Israeli pushback. And I think the extent to which the Israeli pushback here has been obviously quite aggressive would point to the importance of such an initiative. And I think what's interesting, and just to briefly pick up on a bit what Martin said, is it's very, like, the way that Europe has responded also is very illustrative of I think some of the problems inherent in European policy at the moment, but could also perhaps indicate some of the future trajectories of European policy going forward. Again, I think one of the key things, as we've heard from Martin, is EU disunity, and I think this illusion or the prioritization of a search for European unity, a unity that doesn't really exist anymore, that this sort of search for sort of the lowest common denominator in EU positions has very much immobilized European policymaking, and I think has trapped the European Union in a policy that at best made sense 20 years ago in the 1990s, but certainly does not make sense today. It's certainly not reflective of the realities as they are on the ground, but also over 2 decades of failed peace processing. And I think it's interesting in this regard to point out that because of this sort of search for unity and the way that the EU and foreign policy is made up, that we haven't actually had any new EU foreign policy decisions on the Middle East peace process, as it's called in European jargon, since 2016, because European foreign policy needs to be made with the consensus and the agreement of 27 member states. But while this is a real issue, I think at times it's over exaggerated, perhaps deliberately so, because it's I mean, if I was being cynical, it's a way for European member states and the EU to avoid making more difficult decisions, because they can blame it on the lack of consensus. But there are actually ways to not necessarily bypass this consensus, but to still to be able to move EU, to drive EU policy forward. And certainly, I think the EU's vote, the split vote on this resolution, is one indication. There was no reason that the EU and the member states needed to all align, and certainly they could not. But it's always sort of used that excuse for, like Germany perhaps, or other countries who use this as an excuse to try to stop other countries from voting in support of it. And in doing so, you're giving a veto power to blockers, whether it's Hungary or other countries. So I think this just creates this sort of, feeds this policy paralysis. But on the second front, I think the issue is, as I was saying, there hasn't been, the EU is unable, and its member states are unable to update their foreign policy to reflect realities as they are on the ground. And this sort of continued prioritization of this failed strategy is, I think, also contributing to the deadlock that we're seeing, and is very much making the European Union an enforcer of a long since disappeared status quo. So the European Union is trapped in this idea of a Middle East peace process as configured in the 1990s. And in doing so, it's prioritizing the preservation of a failed strategy over a political objective. So just to explain this quickly, because the EU doesn't want to be seen to abandon the Oslo peace process, it's unwilling to take any actions that actually might have a better chance of achieving its policy objective. Now, for the European Union, its policy objective is 2 states. I would say the policy objective should be deoccupation, self-determination, and equal rights. But regardless, there's a number of steps that could lead in this direction. I think certainly encouraging international legal mechanisms to challenge Israeli maximalism and Israeli impunity is an important way to achieve this. But I think, again, in the European psychology, it's very difficult for Western capitals to contemplate anything that goes against this illusion of a peace process. But then, just to finish with a third point, which I wanted to make, is sort of what are the future implications. And as Victor was saying, we don't, this still hasn't been voted on in the full General Assembly, and we still don't have the verdict of the court. And I'd be interested on Victor's point on this in terms of how he sees, what he thinks, how he thinks this could play out. You could say it's a bit of a gamble on the Palestinian side in terms of what exactly will the court say. Will the court say this is apartheid? Will the court say this is illegal occupation or an unlawful presence? Will the court say that the international community has an international duty to, or third state duty to intervene to put it to an end? There are some questions, but I think nonetheless, one would imagine the court will at a minimum say that this will confirm that there's been de facto annexation, and will probably also at a minimum reaffirm the international duty of non-recognition and obligations of the international community to not give effect to Israel's internationally unlawful actions. And perhaps this is something we could talk about in the ensuing conversation. But I think in 2 regards, this is important for the European Union. Is it either it pulls the rug from under the EU's feet. The EU wants to believe that nothing's really changed since the 1990s, that this is a temporary occupation that can be resolved through a political process, that actually sidelining international law is the right thing to do because it encourages the parties to come together in good faith and negotiate. Now, obviously, we know this is not accurate, right? But I think an international a determination by the ICJ that this is at least de facto annexation, perhaps even formal annexation, I think really does put much more pressure on the European Union and its capitals to take a more courageous and forward-leaning position. They've said that some capitals have said there could be sanctions if it was formal annexation. In the case of, if Israel formally extended its sovereignty to the West Bank. If that is actually found to be the case today, what do those capitals do? Those capitals that said there would be sanctions in the event of annexation, I think there will be a lot of pressure. And then the final point to finish on this is third state responsibilities. So the EU's done a bit, I think, to its credit, but it's done not nearly enough in that regard. Will it be under pressure to do more to give more effect? And including, this is not just a European responsibility; it applies to everyone. But the final thing is, I think how would the ruling of the court impact on the decisions of companies? The UN published its database of companies with ties to the settlements. Will a new ruling by the International Court of Justice give new impetus and new momentum to that listing, and will actually encourage more companies to divest from the settlements? So let me finish with that.
Yes, that was certainly a very eloquent presentation, very insightful and comprehensive. So now we can go back to the speakers in the same order with second segment of this discussion to more or less interact with what each of you have kindly said. So, and to also add a forward-looking part to the discussion. So starting from Francesca, if you were to persuade member states of the EU or member states of the United Nations to vote in favor of this resolution, how would you frame it in that regard, and how would it be in their interest to do so? There's also the issue that was mentioned earlier about the same old talking points, as Martin has put it. It's very fascinating that this was repeated. So Martin was saying that people voting against the resolution or abstaining were repeating very old talking points. At the same time, you have the United States representative in the general debate saying exactly the same thing about people trying to vote in favor of the resolution, saying that they are stuck with the same old talking points, that they are not aware of recent developments in the region, of course, alluding to Israeli-Arab normalization with some countries here and there. And they haven't updated themselves on where the region is at the moment. So his position was that people endorsing this resolution are stuck with the same old talking points. Then we have the warning or this sort of threat that this would be the final nail in the coffin of a peace process, and Israel would retaliate and take unilateral measures as well, especially in light of Netanyahu's incoming government, which is likely to bring some very far-right elements of the Israeli political establishment, such as Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, into key ministerial positions, the public security, the military, the finance, and they have been very clear and adamant that their agenda will be to render the Palestinian Authority obsolete, to entrench the occupation and settlement enterprise in the occupied West Bank, and particularly an issue that was raised earlier by members of the Israeli far right was to cancel COGAT, the Israeli civil coordinator in the territories, and put Palestinians under the mandate of the Israeli government directly. So these points combined together, what kind of image does it produce? And I will turn the same question to all of our four speakers, but starting with Francesca.
As I was listening to you, the first thing that occurred to me is that I wouldn't necessarily feel myself comfortable in advocating for the member states to vote. I mean, in a way, we have already, as UN, we have already made an incredibly strong argument and case for the UN to take measures. The Commission of Inquiry recommended the General Assembly to refer the question to the ICJ, as it's hopefully happening. And from my end, I made a compelling case on the law, the reason why member states should not refrain from this next step, meaning this advisory opinion, is because the situation on the ground not only is not in compliance with international law. This is a legal argument, but also from a political point of view, it's a failure. Policy. The realpolitik has failed in Palestine. The two-state discourse that keeps on being cited as a mantra has proven beyond limited and elusive. So it's really, I would make an appeal probably to coherence and consistency, because we face really a situation of cognitive dissonance, where on the one hand, the a political solution is invoked as the ultimate goal to get out of the impasse. At the same time, it's clear that this will never materialize by its own, and all the more, as I said in the report, I don't think that it's fair, and it's really in line with international law to expect that the Palestinians negotiate the conditions of their subjugation. So the reality is already such, and there is a strong consensus among lawyers, legal scholars, and civil society. The occupation has crossed the line of what is permissible under international law. So now, the talking points. I mean, I was listening to what my fellow co-panelists were saying, and I do hope that this is a test. This is an opportunity to expose the hypocrisy of the system. But it seems to me that this has become, in a way, the rule, accepting that there could be a regression, an involution in terms of how disputes are solved by the international community. And I see a serious danger and threat for multilateralism as a whole. So another argument is align your deeds to your words, because it really matters. It's about preserving those principles that have allowed for many of us peace and stability over decades. So it's, again, I often say that the international legal system needs Palestine more than Palestine needs in the international legal system in many respects, because it's really a test for how the international system might deliver on something which is so blatantly abnormal in terms of principles and compliance. And Victor Catan wrote in his wonderful book From Coexistence to Conquest, the Middle East is one of those places where the law is closer to politics than to justice. I think that this is an opportunity to correct that. And I cannot, concerning the language, the quite aggressive language that was used in the General Assembly, I would like to zoom out from the very context of the advisory opinion of the request to refer into the case to the ICJ, and point to the fact that this has become the language used by diplomacy when it comes to the question of Israel-Palestine. In the General Assembly and beyond, there is an accusation of bias and anti-Semitism and a vilification of UN officials and human rights people and bodies and human rights defenders all along. So it's taking the same spirit of shielding Israel from any scrutiny to a different level, but it's still the same phenomenon.
Thank you so much. I couldn't agree more, particularly with the point on the Palestinians and the legal system, and who needs the other more to demonstrate the international system's relevance and credibility. The Palestinian cause becomes a litmus test. So turning now to Victor with the same questions, if you can please share your thoughts.
Thank you, Mohammed. I just want to pick up on a few points that have been mentioned by the other speakers, particularly the reasons why some states voted against the resolution or abstained. And it was interesting because one issue, if you look at what was said, that was a recurring theme that was mentioned by these states, which I think does have implications, is this idea that, well, there are two issues. One is that there was not enough time to debate the question that was added. So this is a resolution that's usually voted on annually. And so what the Palestinians did is they introduced paragraph 18, but there wasn't much time to debate it. So you had some countries that even voted in favor of the resolution. For example, Singapore voted in favor of it, but they made the point that we would like to have had more time to have studied the implications of the question for the advisory opinion. And this is also mentioned by the EU and other states. The second issue that was mentioned a number of times was this by the UK and other states and Australia, was that this is their argument is, and this was also an argument that was raised back in 2003, that the advisory jurisdiction of the court should not be used to resolve a bilateral issue, and that the consent for these kind of disputes is one that can only be, it's consent based. You need two states to agree on the terms of the dispute before it goes to the ICJ. What has been happening over the last 30 or 40 years, and it became even broader during the Chagos advisory opinion, is how any language that's framed in self-determination and in kind of decolonization context can actually be referred to the ICJ. And while that's good news for the Palestinians, it worries some countries that have sovereignty disputes of their own, because then the implications are that they may be next. That the if the UN General Assembly gets a majority to refer a question about their own dispute, they might be facing difficult questions. So I think that's one of the issues to bear in mind. The other point that I found interesting about the vote, Mohammed, you mentioned the Abraham Accords, was that actually the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi, and Sudan and Morocco all voted in favor of the resolution, which I thought was interesting. So when it comes down to it, they still back the Palestinians' request to the ICJ. With regard to another issue that hasn't been mentioned, which I find intriguing, which is like the elephant in the room, of course, is Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, and here we have a Russian Federation invading and annexing a territory, and we see a very robust reaction from the European Union, from the United States, sanctions, etc., etc. And so I think the Palestinians have kind of, it's a clever way of saying, hold on, it's not the only, Russia's not the only country that's behaving, that's doing annexations, etc. What's happening in the Middle East? Why aren't you doing anything about this? And so I think that the timing of this, I think, is connected to what has been happening in the Ukraine, and it's something we should think of. And of course, the Israeli election, I think, is the far right being elected into power, and the return of Netanyahu is probably something that also is a factor that didn't very simply, as you've all said, no change on the ground, and this is something the Palestinians can at least be seen to be doing. That may, depending on what the court says, have some implications, but we'll have to wait to see what they say. I know Hugh asked me what I think the ICJ might say, but I would not want to. I'd hesitate to try and suggest what judges might rule. I just point out though that the current president is American and the vice president is Russian, so I don't know if they'll still be in those roles when the question is referred to the court, but that is something to bear in mind.
That is certainly fascinating, and I'd like to hear more when we turn to the Q&A segment. So now turning to Martin, if you can share with us your thoughts on a forward-looking and a policy-oriented point on where to go from here. Right.
I will first follow up briefly on what Victor was mentioning on the this point or this objection about member states not having enough time, which was maybe the EU's main objection. But as the EU member states' voting behavior shows, it wasn't the real reason for the voting positions, because some member states voted in favor, despite maybe not being completely happy with the process. But I think I also understand why the Palestinians submitted it quite late, because they didn't want to get trapped in a very polarized and difficult process, which could lead to the watering down of their questions and the blockage of the whole process, given how much adversity there is to them and their agenda from the United States in particular as the most powerful state in the world and within the United Nations. But going to the forward-looking agenda, why is it in Europeans' interest to actually support this resolution and the advisory opinion? I would say there are a whole bunch of reasons, and Francesca already mentioned some of them. I would say starting from where many European member states are, if you really want to create chances to restart a political process, and ultimately there will have to be a political process to resolve the situation, then how does this prevent or harm those prospects? On the contrary, I would argue that it's precisely the sidelining of international law and international institutions, multilateral institutions, over the past decades, specifically on this conflict, the sidelining of these institutions and processes, which has been one of the key factors why peace process has constantly, repeatedly failed. Bringing in international law, which was designed specifically to guide the international community and states in resolving conflicts and disputes, should help rather than hinder. And we do accept involvement of international institutions like the ICJ in many other conflicts, and it would help to put the two parties, as we say, a little bit more on an equal footing by making clearer what the rules of the game are. Secondly, I think the importance is of the opinion is that hopefully it will strengthen the wall of legality, the kind of normative or international so-called consensus that has been around this conflict on this question. Because on the ground, the power asymmetry is clear, and there is currently, unfortunately, no prospect for ending the occupation at this point in time. But at the level of the international community and at the level of international law, this normative framework is very important, but there are efforts to also erode it and even destroy it. That's what we have seen in the 4 years of the Trump administration. That was basically 4 years of a systematic effort to demolish this whole international architecture. And that's why reinforcing this wall of legality is, I think, so important. And that links to, again, what Francesca was already mentioning, that, this is about the whole international rule-based order, international rule of law, which is in the interest of Europeans to maintain and to reinforce. And specifically, the first principle of international law is prohibition on acquisition of territory by force. You can't expand your borders by force, which was the key principle in the resolution on Ukraine, which was voted in the UN General Assembly a month earlier, and where the Europeans and the US were so keen to maximize the global support, and rightly so, for this resolution. And exactly 1 month later, we basically undermine the same principle on another conflict, which undermines the Western credibility in trying to convince countries of the global South to support them when it comes to international law on the question of Ukraine. The final point I would make why it is important to support is Europeans are very much opposed to violence, and they oppose violent resistance by the Palestinians to the occupation. This is the most non-violent, the most legal and legitimate alternative that you have. If you have a dispute with your neighbor, you can have a fist fight, or you can go to a court. That's what the courts are for. And if we close down even this route, then we are just incentivizing more violence on the ground. So those would be my key suggestions for the Europeans to reconsider their positions before the plenary vote.
Thank you so much, Martin, for a very thoughtful follow-up on your earlier presentation. So turning now to Hugh on the same questions, if you can please share your thoughts.
So I would just firstly reiterate all the good points that have been made so far. So it's about supporting the ICJ ruling. It's about policy coherence, as Francesca said, at a time when I think there is a widespread, I think I can use the word anger, certainly frustration in the Middle East and elsewhere in the world with the perception of European hypocrisy, why international law should be applied in the case of Ukraine and not elsewhere. I think the sense amongst Arab publics and elsewhere, I think, is palpable and something that the EU needs to take seriously, even if it's not always apparent in its government level meetings. But also ultimately, international law is obviously important for the EU and the EU's DNA and so on and so forth. But it makes good policy, like letting international law do what it was designed to do, which in this case is to disincentivize the illegal acquisition of territory by force and to make this unsustainable. This is what non-recognition, this is what international law and everything that's been built up over the last 100 years, this is what it's designed to do. And, curbing it or trying to immobilize it or hold it hostage to political considerations is counterproductive I would say in every case, but especially this case, which is just about, you do this, you entrench Israeli impunity, as we talked about, and Israeli maximalism, or actually allowing international law to operate as it was intended is important in terms of, I think, rewriting a bit this current imbalance in relations, but also slowly and gradually in conjunction with other policies, but slowly and gradually making it clear and apparent to the Israeli government, Israeli politicians, and the Israeli public that moving towards deoccupation is a smarter way forward than maintaining perpetual occupation. And then what I would say as a final point, which I think is perhaps just as important, is when you speak to a lot of European officials, or at least privately, there is a sense of, I think, shared frustration a lot of the time. And I'd say, in many cases, shared analysis in terms of the problems of the situation, even acknowledgement of the reality on the ground in private. But at the same time, I think there's a bit of a drift. The European Union has spent over 25 years backing a two-state solution, which is no longer seen privately as attainable, even if they don't say that publicly. And so there's this policy drift. If we can't do the Oslo peace process, what should we be doing? Now, all of us here on the panel have ideas, and there's plenty of reports. But I think at capital level, there is still this not just paralysis, but I think uncertainty of the way forward. And one could say that a new ruling by the ICJ could perhaps provide an important sort of impulse in the future direction that European policy should take. Perhaps even a bit of shock therapy to try to jolt the European Union out of its current paralysis and to actually start getting it to think in a more constructive and forward-looking way forward. And what I would say in this regard is, you need, first of all, and this is how the ICJ opinion could help. First of all, you need a more correct diagnosis of the situation on the ground. So, as international human rights organizations have described it, apartheid. The EU doesn't use that language, but it does, at least privately, talk about, and actually also publicly, talk about the entrenchment of a one-state reality of open-ended occupation and unequal rights. So you see these grains that do exist on the European side, but they haven't yet really, if I can use the word, blossomed. And so the ICJ opinion, if it sort of backs up a lot of these characterizations, could be an important step in terms of trying to get the EU to more strategically reflect on the reality as it is today, not as the EU would like it to be, and certainly not as it was in the 1990s. So you need a new diagnosis. Then you need a new strategy, which is to acknowledge that the Middle East peace process is defunct and has failed, and you need to look at a new way forward. There's many things to talk about on the Palestinian side and the Israeli side, but certainly international law should be a key component of that strategy, and also an important tool in moving towards deoccupation. And I think, to me, this really just drives home the need for a real serious EU policy recalibration. And finally, I think in terms of there will have to be reflection on what is the future political objective, which maybe this ICJ opinion obviously won't talk about political objectives, but I think the extent to which it may start centering the conversation about or continue to push this shifting narrative that Francesca and others have been so important in doing, which is talking about self-determination, talking about equality, talking about rights. I think rather than making this about one state, two state, I think this discussion, this narrative, and this framing needs to be at the center of any new policy. So will you have a choice? Do you continue to support inequality and occupation, or do you support equality and self-determination?
Thank you so much, Hugh, for a very thoughtful presentation. We will now open the floor for the Q&A segment. So first I have a number of written questions, but before that I have a question from my colleague, Dr. Rami Abdu, who's the chairman of Euromed Monitor. He's a professor of law and finance. If you can please go ahead, Dr. Rami.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you all for your thoughtful and enlightening comments. Actually, my question to Francesca, build the frame you have articulated right now. My question actually is related to the court itself. In case the resolution passed, is there any room for your mandate to contribute voluntarily to the court or not? Also, do you have the mandate to discuss with the European countries or European member states directly the consequences and the implications of their rejections for going to the court, not only on Palestinian rights, but also on justice and international human rights agenda? Other question actually to Martin and Loft related to the role of the civil societies and or society and research centers and policy centers in European countries and European content, not only on the level of legislative bodies, but also on the level of this European decision makers. Should we expect any rule for this these organizations or this community to take part in pushing toward ending such a passive rule of the European decision makers and European countries, or should we keep silent like Middle Eastern countries where the role of civil society is absent, has no influence on the decision making? Thank you very much again.
Thank you so much for very interesting questions. So we have the question to Francesca and the questions to the other speakers in terms of if there is a room to press and push decision makers in Europe to take a more meaningful position, as well as Francesca's mandate, and whether there is a room to influence the positions of European member states. I have also a number of written questions that I will go through very quickly that were sent from the audience. So the first question I have is, what happens if the resolution doesn't pass? Or what would that signal to Israel if it succeeds, along with the US, in torpedoing the resolution, or at least preventing Western countries or democratic countries from supporting the resolution? And then the second question is, how likely and significant would the risk be of Israel, the US, the UK, and the EU ignoring the ICJ's ruling if it rules the occupation is illegal, like the situation is now with the advisory opinion of the court on the separation wall that is not being a prominent issue on the agenda anymore? And then there is the question of how can Israel retaliate? It has already promised retaliation if the resolution passes. What should Palestinians expect? How to brace against such a storm? And the last question I have is, what are their steps in addition to this resolution? What other steps can the international community, EU member states, Palestinians themselves take to put an end to Israeli violations, or at least prevent the situation from getting dramatically worse in light of Israel's incoming government. So thank you so much. We start with the same order of speakers, and Francesca.
Yeah, thank you. I think that the first question was regarding my role vis-a-vis the court, not vis-a-vis member states. So if
Yes,
this is correct, well, I think that the first thing is that there will be opportunities to make to present written submissions, and what I suspect the court will do is to receive all relevant documents that exist at the UN level. And so there will be surely my report, which is, as far as I can say, very pertinent to the consideration of the question, at least the first question, the consequences of the continuous violation of the right of self-determination, because my report was about self-determination and its engineered violation through a 55-year-old occupation because of its settler colonial nature. And so, yeah, there would be an opportunity to, of course, to have an influence through this kind of work and the I think written contributions. Then, in terms of the other question, what if the resolution is not passed? Look. One of the questions that I was considering myself, because I didn't make this recommendation myself, it was a recommendation of the Commission of Inquiry in its report that recommended to refer the case to the ICJ for an advisory opinion. Because, and again, I stand behind it, and I really think it's going to be an incredible opportunity. At the same time, my point is also that in the case. To take just one case, when Russia declared a war against Ukraine recently this year, there was not the necessity of an advisory opinion of the ICJ to declare the occupation illegal, to declare the war an act of aggression, and to take measures. So the point is that international law is really adamant and clear about the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. What is lacking is political will, and international law is as strong as the will of, as effective as the will of state to enforce it. So the point is that we would face the reality of state still hiding themselves behind this the status quo. So the role of civil society, of the human rights community, including independent expert and UN mechanism, will be to continue to argue in favor of a principled and objective compliance with international law and with the UN Charter, and treat the occupation in the Palestinian territory as illegal, and take all the consequences that derive from that. The last question is about, and if there is a resolution and is ignored. Again, I often say that what is at risk, as again, this, I don't think I should make this point again, but it's the international rule-based order is really at stake. Here, it's about guaranteeing human rights protection, which should be objective and universal. If the international community is not capable to grant these to the Palestinians, is making a huge exception, which is corroborating the perception that we are not into a fair and equal world, and we are turning human rights protection into protectionism, where rights are not for all, but just for a club. This is the image, and this is the sense, the message that the international community will pass.
Thank you so much. And what do you think other measures the international community, the Palestinians themselves, or the EU can take in parallel with this resolution to sort of prevent violations on the ground or advance a solution to the conflict?
I've recommended in my report that there should be an international protective presence on the ground now, because this has been, as we speak, this has been the most deadly year for the people in the occupied Palestinian territory. There have been, and in Israel, Palestine, there have been 30 Israeli killed this year and over 200 Palestinians. This is unconscionable. These deaths are on everyone's shoulders, because again, the international community and the United Nations have the responsibility to prevent this from happening. So there is no reason for Israel to maintain its boots on the ground, but as it does in the name of its security, well, the United Nations should guarantee that they are able to help guarantee Israel's security, but within its own metropolitan territory, within its own borders, so to speak, and not in the territory that it illegally occupies. So it's absolutely priority to have the deployment of observers and an international presence that creates a buffer between the Palestinians and the violent settlers and the ideological settlers and the occupation forces.
Thank you so much. So now going to Victor with the same questions. What happens if the resolution doesn't pass or doesn't get a majority of support from Western nations? Significance of Israel, or the likelihood of Israel and the international community, particularly EU and the US, ignoring it, like the 2003 advisory opinion, and what other steps should be taken? Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mohammed. I also just want to quickly just jump in on the question that was asked of Francesca about her reports as special rapporteur. I was looking at the resolution again, and in fact, the 8th preambular paragraph cites Francesca's report. So that's an easy segue for the ICJ to refer to your work. So I think it will be looked at during if the question goes to the court. With regard to the what happens if the resolution does not pass? Well, quite simply, then the question isn't referred to the court. I'm not a betting man, but if I had to take a bet, I think that's unlikely, because Israel and the United States would have to persuade at least 40 states to vote against the resolution. So, in other words, all those states that abstained would have to decide to vote no, and I think that's quite a big leap to do. And they'd have to explain why they changed their votes. I don't think that could happen. It's not beyond the possibility, I suppose, but it's a big job. There was also an interesting question related to that about what if democratic countries don't support it. I mean, legally, it doesn't make any difference. The UN Charter doesn't distinguish between states that are democratic or not democratic or have different forms of government. It's just a question about whether you get a majority. So long as you get a majority vote, the question is referred to the court. In practice, if we subscribe to the view that the West matters still, then of course the fact that democratic countries don't vote for it won't look good. But if we look at the resolution, as already mentioned, a number of European countries voted for it: Ireland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Poland, Portugal, and Slovenia. And other democratic countries outside Europe, such as Brazil and Chile, Indonesia, and South Africa, also voted for it. So I think that you will have a mix of different types of countries voting in favor of the resolution. There was also a question. Well, if states ignore the resolution, that's the nature of international politics. That they're not bound by a court advisory opinion. But I think, if states, particularly in the West, claim to be law-abiding and claim that there is a so-called global legal ruled order, whatever you want to call it, international rule of law, then it'd look rather odd if they then ignored an opinion of the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. But of course, also it depends on what the court says and the majority of judges. The more, a more persuasive opinion would have perhaps greater weight. But again, this is the nature of international law. The law is not self-executing. So there would be the Palestinians, even if they were to receive a favorable opinion, would have a lot of persuasion, a lot of lobbying, a lot of follow-up to do. I'll leave my answer at that.
Muhammad, we don't hear you. Hello?
Since we've seemed to have lost our host, Martin, do you want to go next?
Can you hear me now?
Here he is. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so if you can please go ahead and address these questions, and also the question that was sent to you or addressed to you by my colleague Rami on the issue of civil society's role in Europe. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So starting with civil society, so I think it has an important role in advocating towards governments in Europe to vote in favor, to vote for international law. Because the positions that each government takes is basically a reflection of a kind of internal balance of power between different actors within that member state. There is some external lobbying. We know there has been lobbying at high level from Israel, from the US, and so on. But this kind of lobbying is not the central thing, which is decisive. It only works if it falls on kind of fertile ground. And the key factors are internal. It's the internal political balance in each member state. And civil society is a part of this kind of a balance. On the other hand, I don't expect, even if everyone put massive effort into this, I don't expect major shifts by member states between the committee vote and the plenary vote in December. That is quite rare to happen. So I would almost say the main role or opportunity for the civil society is to use this moment, especially with, or in those governments that fail to vote in favor and fail to support this, to use this as a kind of a pedagogical moment and explain to the broader public the double standards, the inconsistency, the hypocrisy, which is at play here, that this is not just a matter of injustice on the ground, but that there's a double injustice. There's a injustice at the international level, which many of our governments are fully participating in. And there was a question, what significance, or what's the point of doing this, given that the previous Court of Justice advisory opinion was largely ignored? I don't see this as a magic bullet. And let's be clear, this opinion by a Court of Justice is not a way to bring freedom to the Palestinians and peace to the region. It's only a small step, but it's a step that it's very legitimate and a step that can be helpful. In my view, maybe the main positive effect of it is that it firms up the facts and the law against the constant stream of propaganda that tries to confuse the picture and turn the reality upside down. And unfortunately, again, many of our governments are participating in this effort, as I was mentioning before, by twisting the reality and misrepresenting even this whole effort to get, turning an international court of justice into somehow a unilateral instrument or a way to single out Israel. I think establishing the facts and the legality is very important in itself, and can be then a helpful instrument in further efforts on this issue. But it's not, something that on its own will transform the situation, and we should have no illusions about that. Finally, you asked about what steps, if I still may, should be taken in parallel. We could talk about a number of things, and we could talk about a number of things that we would like to see, but unfortunately are not going to happen given the current political reality. But just one example, Hugh mentioned before the existence of this UN database of companies involved in settlements, and it is again an example of a very small, very tiny step that unfortunately the West and most of the European countries were not willing to support, because what we do as Europeans is to frequently state our opposition to the settlements rhetorically. But whenever there's even the smallest step that is a little bit practical, that goes beyond the rhetoric, we get very, very uncomfortable and often actually turn against it. And that, I think, is a fundamental contradiction and a problem.
Thank you so much for a very powerful way of ending it. So now we turn to Hugh with the same questions. If you can please go ahead.
And Martin makes a really powerful point, and I think this is not just a case of international or Western or European passivity. It is actually that in a number of instances that we can point to, European governments have actually intervened to protect the occupation and to protect the settler movement from international law. I think the UN database is a good example, but we can point to a lot of other examples in this case. So, what could the EU do? I think at the very least, it's stop shielding unlawful actions from the full weight of international law and the EU's own laws in many instances. On the role of, to go back to the question, the role of civil society, I think being very well covered. I think civil society, European civil society, is extremely important and challenging, bad policy and inaction, and to continue demonstrating that there continues to be a weight of European public opinion in support of ending the occupation of Palestinian rights and accountability for EU actions that may go against that. I think the risks of this resolution not happening or being blocked, we've covered. I would want to add, though, that while perhaps not the most likely outcome, I would still flag the possibility, however slight, that President Abbas himself could actually be the one that slows or derails this. The reasons we don't have time to go into why he's doing this. I think there's a lot of actually different dynamics. A lot of this is about his own frustration with the lack of international action and the American passivity. And I would just recall that I forget the year, but he did actually slow or block a follow-up to the Goldstone report on Gaza. So anyway, this may not happen. I think things have gone too far, but I'd still put that as a one sort of thing to keep an eye on, based on what the Americans could offer President Abbas going forward. In terms of, I think the question we haven't talked about, which I think was Israeli retaliation. I don't have time to go into all the creative ways Israel could retaliate, but I think the more likely ones that it's done in the past is it's cutting funding to the Palestinian Authority. So it's tax revenues that Israel collects on behalf of the PA, which is already docking, it's already cut over similar actions. It could do so more in the future, revoking travel privileges for PA or PLO leaders. Which again, I think demonstrate just how much Israel, that we all know, right? But it demonstrates how much Israel controls absolutely every single aspect of Palestinian life and the Palestinian territory. And of course, then using this to justify things it would have done anyway, which is increasing settlement building, dispossession of Palestinians. But I think Israel does have a bit of a dilemma, is that, ultimately everything we talked about, this sort of Middle East peace process, as it's become the Palestinian Authority, as it's become, as many Palestinians will point to, as a subcontractor of Israel's occupation, a lot of these structures that have been put in place serve Israel's occupation. And so there are limits, I think, if we're dealing with a far right government, who knows? But up until now, there's been limits in terms of how far Israel can go in terms of weakening the Palestinian Authority, which ultimately serves Israel's interests, which a lot of Israeli members of the Israeli security establishment would I think would agree with. The final question about how to prevent deterioration. I think that, let's be fair, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the Palestinian side, while acknowledging the overarching context of Israeli occupation and international Western negative interventionism. But I think clearly trying to rebuild, reactivate, and re-legitimize the Palestinian national movement is a huge requirement that falls to Palestinians. But ultimately, I think, clearly, as Martin was saying, this ultimately comes down to Israel and Israelis deciding to end the occupation. There's no amount of international interventionism or Palestinian activism can actually do that. It can contribute, but at the end of the day, it needs to be an Israeli decision to do this. And I think a potential future ICJ ruling could be an important element to this if European governments were willing to use this and open their eyes to actually start making the argument to Israel as friends of Israel, to say things that perhaps we all know here on the panel, that this is a very negative trajectory, not just for Palestinians, but also for Israelis, Israeli Jews who believe in, who have aspirations of Israel as a Jewish majority and democratic country. That leading the current trajectory leads towards apartheid. Apartheid is something that Israeli former prime ministers have themselves warned about. Heads of Israeli intelligence agencies, Mossad and Shibet, have themselves warned about. I think this is an opportunity for European governments to say that this warning has now come true, that this is now a reality of entrenching apartheid, and that Israelis face are at a crossroads, whether they continue to embrace apartheid or actually move towards deoccupation or full equal rights. But ultimately, Europe's role in this is not just to point out this reality and the dilemma that it presents for Israel, but also to firmly close the door on inequality as a future acceptable outcome. To be very clear that whether in 2 states or 1 state, the core requirement will be equality and equal rights.
That is a powerful note to end with. But now we have, I think, 3 minutes left in our time count. So I want to turn quickly to Francesca. Something that I heard from a previous mandate holder, a previous special rapporteur on the occupied territories, is that representative of a European member states or European Union member states in the Security Council, like one of the key member states, and it's not Germany, and I'm not supposed to say the name, but he said something very eloquent in that regard. He said that Palestinians have my sympathy, Israel has my support. So how do you see this dynamic resonating in this situation? And I think we can conclude by giving each speaker about 1 minute to give their concluding remarks, and then we finish the session. Thank you so much.
You always give me these very hard to answer questions.
Yes, but you also
because I only have 1 minute, let me tell you what I really think I could be, I could convey as a special rapporteur. I think that overall, this discussion is healthy and necessary because it's helping what I call the conscientization around the question of legality and how legality is also entrapped and caged in prisons in the case of the occupied Palestinian territory. In the same vein as it's unrealistic, on top of unfair and immoral, to expect that a subjugated and oppressed, a vilified and humiliated population will enjoy this condition in perpetuity. So it's clear that the Palestinians are going to revolt against the oppression until they enjoy freedom. At the same time, I think it's important as part of the human rights community to continue in our own roles and responsibility to reinforce the message of that legality shouldn't be an option, should be the course of action to reorient politics in the Middle East and beyond.
Thank you so much. So now we turn to Victor, if you have a final concluding remark.
Yeah, I'll simply conclude by saying that one of the advantages of this strategy, and if it's successful in going to the court, is that it puts Palestine back in the spotlight in international politics. It's been neglected for so long, and also reminds people that the Palestinian struggle is a legitimate one. And I think that's sometimes often forgotten. Thanks.
Yes, very powerful indeed. We move now to Martin. Your concluding remarks.
Right, so I would just quickly respond to the member state whom you quoted about support for Israeli sympathy for the Palestinians. Even if you fully support Israel and have no sympathy for the Palestinians, why not support an opinion by the International Court of Justice? That's not about whether we are pro-Israel or pro-Palestine. This is about international law, which is universal and neutral. And nobody should be afraid of clarifying the rules of the game.
Indeed, yes, couldn't agree more. So now we turn to Hugh and your concluding remark.
Sure. Clearly, I think it's in the European Union's interest and the interest of its member states to support a future ICJ resolution. It's not just a matter of demonstrating to Palestinians that international law can work as it's intended to. But I think it's ultimately, as we've talked about in the past, over the last hour, I think it's in the European Union's interest to demonstrate that international law remains the primary and unique international mechanism for resolving international conflict at a time when Russia's invading Ukraine. I think there's an overwhelming need and necessity for the European Union to once again to continue to demonstrate that it not just that it embraces international law, but it's prepared to apply it to friends and foe alike.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Hugh, for concluding on this powerful. And I would like to thank our speakers and the audience for this very enlightening and interactive discussion. So thanks so much, Francisca, Victor, Martin, and Hugh, for a very powerful and enlightened discussion on the topic of the International Court of Justice and the illegality or otherwise of Israel's occupation. We look forward to more discussions in the future, and have a very good night.
Thank you for having
Thank you
us.
very much.
Goodbye,
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you. Bye.